Hello. What have we got here? Big old package from merry old England. And inside was this. An FM Towns computer. Japanese persocom from the late 80s, early 90s. Very powerful system for its time. Had a nice library of games. Now this one is in the process of being dismantled because I bought this non-working. Apparently, according to the seller, the power supply is the problem. He mentioned that there was a hissing noise that came from the power supply before it failed, and that suggests that the problem might have been a capacitor issue, which is fairly common for systems of this vintage, and of course the ability to fix small problems like that is pretty much a prerequisite for collectors of vintage video games these days. I've noticed a lot of people are very hesitant to do stuff like this, but personally I'm not. I mean, if you can pick up a pencil, you pretty much can pick up a soldering iron, and anyone can take apart electronic equipments and find out how to buy the proper capacitors and replace the faulty ones, or just replace them all. Well, as you can see here, and as you may well know, the FM Towns computers were based around fairly common Intel processors. But the architecture itself was not like the computers that we had here in the West. The ugly beige towers that we had in the West, based around DOS or Windows. Us unfortunate kids here in the West, we did not have access to wonderful machines like this, or as you can see there, the X68000, which is in the same caliber. It came out a little bit earlier. It launched in the 1987 and was based around a Motorola 68000 processor, whereas this was based around the Intel processors. Now, you might ask, why on earth would anyone be interested in systems like these? And I think I want to give you my perspective on it. So yeah, why would anyone want to buy old computers like that? From my point of view, and I think this applies to most collectors of vintage video games, is that they first start with the games and systems that they grew up with. Maybe they got rid of them at some point in their life, and suddenly they want them back, or maybe it's stuff that they coveted as a child, but circumstances prevented them from ever having them, and now that they're adult with a disposable income, they want to kind of rectify that chapter of their life. And once you start with that, you kind of get into the hobby, and it kind of expands your horizon. Like for me, I started with systems that I knew that, and the games that I couldn't get as a child, and there were plenty, because circumstances really prevented me from having the systems and the games that I wanted as a child. Pretty much anything from before the PlayStation, I had very limited exposure to. So I started with those, and And then my horizon expanded, and I became aware of systems that I hardly even knew existed as a child, like the PC Engine, and fell in love with the library, the excellent library. And then the final frontier of video game collecting, if you're a fan of Japanese video games, which I am, is stuff like that, and the X68000, the MSX computer, uh, and uh, and more oddball stuff like the PC98 or PC88, and there are even some even more obscure systems that you can get into, and that's for I think for the craziest collectors. That's the really odd end, like that's the deep end of the pool, especially because there are many barriers that that will dissuade you from pursuing that path. I mean, for one thing, take the FM Town for example. The games for that system are incredibly expensive. I'm not too familiar with the library, but the handful of games, uh, most commonly coveted games for that system, I think all of them would set me back at least the, the same amount of money that I paid for the system, if not several times that. And that might dissuade some people, especially people who are more collectors than they are gamers, because they want the games for the shelf. Me, it's not really that big of a priority for me when it comes to PC systems like this. For the consoles, I like to have the games that I like, and for the most part, they are more affordable. But for example, for the FM Towns, I'll be more than happy to just burn the games on CDs and just play them like that. And that's the good thing about the FM Towns uh, in comparison to the other systems that I mentioned. In that most of the games for this system came on CDs. I think all of them did actually. It's a CD-based system, so it's fairly easy to to copy the games and just run them. Uh, it gets much more complicated once you get into the systems like the X68000 or the what's it called, the MSX, and the other systems, the ones that used floppy disks. Floppy disks were a horrible technology, and unless you want to play around with those, for example, for the X68000, what I have on there is I have a flash-based hard drive solution, and to get that up and running, you have to be very technically proficient. You have to be able to hunt down very technical information, and you have to be handy with a soldering iron, not be afraid of opening up a PC, and you also need to be able to navigate a kind of a DOS-like operating system environment. So yeah, there are a lot of things to keep in mind, and some other barriers are these systems. Obviously, they had no Western presence, so if you want to buy them, you are pretty much forced to import them from Japan, unless you get lucky, like I did with this FM Towns, and one just pops up somewhere close to you for a reasonable amount. I I paid, I think, 160 Great British pounds for that system there. As I said, it's broken. and that's including shipping. So, in my opinion, that's a good price. You know, it's not amazing, but if you want amazing deals, you have to live in Japan, and you have to have started like 5 years ago, where not as many people were collecting stuff like this as there are now. So even for really obscure systems like that, there is considerable competition. No, maybe not so much from Westerners, although there are some, but from the Japanese themselves as well. So yeah, there is that. There is also the matter of marrying a system like this with a display. Uh, the thing about Japanese computers is, unlike Western computers, that they are mostly based around 15 kilohertz. Most of the games run 15 kilohertz. There are some that run 31 kilohertz and some that run 24 kilohertz. So you can't just take a PC monitor and somehow hook it up and expect to be able to play all the games. Because if they display at 15 or 24 kilohertz, it's not going to show up right on a PC monitor. So now these had their own monitors, and I have actually the proper monitor for the X68000. It says TriSync. It does 31, 24, and 15 kilohertz. It's a pretty small monitor, but it's relatively nice. Unfortunately, mine needs to be recapped, and I've been putting it off for a couple of years. But once I do that, I can actually use it for my X68000 as well as the FM Towns. So there's the advantage there. But if you don't want to go through the hassle and pay the exuberant fees involved in what's importing a monitor from Japan, and risk the chance of it breaking during shipping, mine unfortunately made it safely. Unless you want to do that, you're gonna have to look into other solutions, like maybe a scan converter like the X-Select. No, it's not the X-Select. It's something. It's something made by Microsoft. It's one of those. It's like the XRGB, but it's designed specifically for Japanese PCs. It's pretty pricey and hard to get a hold of. So there's a lot of barriers that prevent it, and that's why the Japanese PC scene here in the West is actually pretty small. I think if you want to get into it, the three most obvious, as I mentioned, systems that you can get into are the FM Towns. There is the MSX and the X68000. Now, to me, when I started, the most obvious system to get into for me personally was the X68000, and that was the system that I chose to purchase first. And I always had in the back of my mind, maybe in the future I will invest in some of the other systems, because back in the early 2010s, I watched a lot of YouTube videos about retro video game related stuff, because I think in 2008 was when I started looking into getting back into video games from my past, because at that point, being a fan of Japanese video games, I noticed that the Japanese developers were not really as prolific as they used to be. They were not dominating the market, and Western developed games never have and never will interest me. So there was kind of a big vacuum in my life in terms of just, it was a big hobby for me, video games. I don't have that many hobbies. There's that and movies to keep me busy. And once video games were kind of going away, and I had two choices. Either I could just accept that this was going to be a bygone era, and just find something else to occupy myself with, or just go back to all the video games that I missed in my youth, and try and keep myself entertained that way. And I'm glad that in around 2008, 2009, I chose to go back, and that kind of opened my eyes to how wide a field it is, and it was kind of like a sponge. I was just taking in all the information I could get, and I, like most people who are into Japanese video PCs, I started watching Luke Moore-Swan's videos. Hey buddy, if you're looking, I love your videos. And back then he had an amazing collection of really oddball stuff, like Japanese PCs, and he showcased them all, and I watched all his videos, and every time there was something new and exciting, and I looked at these, and at that point all the barriers that prevent you from getting into this hobby, Japanese PCs, kind of prevented me, but I kind of coveted them because the games looked really interesting. And so finally I decided to go with the X68000, weighing many factors, like the library of games, how sexy the machine was. Like I like aesthetics when it comes to electronics and stuff like that, and I don't know, the Japanese, they were really good at industrial design in the 80s. You could see that in the design of the FM Towns and the X68000 and the X68000 Compact. They're phenomenal in terms of just the aesthetics of the design of the unit itself. Really beautiful. In the West, computers for the most part were just ugly beige boxes. I mean, in the mid 80s, there was Apple and Steve Jobs. They were trying to create something beautiful, but you know, as you know, or you might not know, Steve Jobs' career with Apple, it didn't last too long. He kind of got muscled out, and then Apple's computers started to become slightly uglier and uglier until they were pretty much indistinguishable from just IBM clones. And so, if you wanted something beautiful in terms of computers, the Japanese computers were pretty much your only choice. So in terms of that, they interested me as well. But I gravitated towards the X68000 because of mostly because of Castlevania. It had an exclusive. Well, not an exclusive because it was ported to the PlayStation 1. But that game kind of interested me, and then I saw all the other interesting games and arcade ports. For example, there was Strider, for example, a pretty good port of that, and Ghouls and Ghosts, and a lot of other. So the games are really good looking, at least compared to something like the MSX computer, which the MSX was the hardware of the MSX was terrible because it was actually designed by Microsoft, and yeah, nothing good ever came out of Microsoft, and the hardware that they designed for the MSX, this was in the early 80s, was really not forward thinking because it did not have good hardware based around game development. And that's one area where the FM Towns and the X68000 excel, and distinguished themselves from PCs in the West in that they actually had specific game development hardware built in. Like they had hardware support for sprites and backgrounds and all sorts of stuff like that. So they really excelled at video games, while at the same time also being a pretty good machine for just serious PCs work, stuff like that. So they were kind of like the Amiga 500 here in the West, but the Amiga was not really. I guess it was mostly in Europe that it was popular, and I don't think it was really used that much for serious work. I mean, businesses didn't have them, but stuff like the FM Towns and X68000, they kind of targeted themselves as both the gamers and the serious and the people wanting to do serious work. So yeah, and while the hardware-wise, the X68000 and the FM Towns were kind of toe-to-toe, the library of the X68000 kind of put it ahead of the two other competitors for my money and interest at the time. So I chose to go with the X68000, and now have the FM Towns several years later, and probably sometime in the future I will invest in a MSX as well, because the MSX actually had different iterations. There was the plain vanilla MSX, then there was the MSX2 and the MSX2 Plus, and tail end there was the Turbo R. And at some point, I don't know if it was 2 Plus or Turbo R, it actually got some hardware support for that made it more friendly for video game development. So games stopped being so choppy near the tail end, and so then it got some standout titles that might be interesting, like Space Mambo, and just for curiosity's sake, you might I might want to check out like stuff like the Castlevania game for the MSX. Konami had a lot of stuff on there. Compile had a lot of their early stuff. So it's an interesting platform overall, but the FM Towns and the X68000 were just more interesting, in my opinion. So yeah, but I wasn't really planning on getting the FM Towns this early, actually. I kind of started looking into it, but my financial situation at the time, well, for the last 3 years actually, and for the next couple of years, is not going to be stellar. So back when I bought the X68000, I had a lot of money to burn. Not so much right now, but fortunately for me, right around the time this thing came up for sale on eBay, I just managed to sell a piece of hardware that was just lying around and I wasn't using it. I had an NES and a NES RGB board, and I decided to just install the NES RGB board into the NES and try and sell it, because I wasn't using any of them. I have a heavy Famicom with an NES RGB inside it, and that's what I use. I don't really have much nostalgia for the US style NES, and I actually prefer to collect for the Famicom. So I sold that off, and it just so happens, for the exact amount that I sold it, I bought this thing. I basically found this thing on eBay for sale. There was a guy in UK, and believe it or not, his last name was Townsend. So it's kind of meant to be, I guess. And he had this for sale, and I kind of contacted him and I said, hey, I'll offer you this, the exact amount that I got from that sale, with shipping. If you can do that, just let me know. And he said yes, and a couple of days later, here it is. Now, currently, I am in the process of taking it apart to repair it. Hopefully, just replacing the capacitors on the power supply will do the trick. I will probably also recap any other capacitors I find inside it while I'm in there, because that thing is a bitch to take apart. And that seems to be a theme going again with Japanese PCs. The X68000 compact also is a bitch to take apart, because they're very well engineered. They're just not the engineering is not optimized around the ability to take them apart, because you were really not supposed to do that. Uh, uh, if you wanted to expand the memory, or put in some input boards, that was easy enough. You had easy access to that, but to actually get inside and mess around, forget about it. It's like a puzzle taking that thing apart. And in fact, I am stuck where I am at this stage. I managed to take off the side panels and the top, but the front kind of just will not come apart, and I'm kind of scared to be too forceful with it, because it's all based around like plastic tabs and stuff like that, and they break easily. And it's the same thing with the X68000. I actually have a video where I explain how to the X68000 compact, how you're supposed to take it apart, because it's held together by just one screw, and the rest is just tabs that kind of plug into one another, and it's not it's not that intuitive to take them apart. So anyway, in the future, I'll probably put up some other videos where I try to as I repair the FM towns, I'll probably update with some videos while I explain what I did and stuff like that. And I might actually want to upgrade the CPU as well. I haven't decided right now. So, well, until next time.